Hello, I'm in the Odesa region of Ukraine, and I am on the front over here too. And I say the front because there is a front here. It's just the front line is on the water. The front line is in the air when it comes to the constant drone attacks on this front. And when we got here on the 30th, we were woken up at 3 a.m. by an incessant bombing. Like a few times it was pretty close. Other times we could see like it was clear that they were going towards certain storage facilities and stuff like that. But the bombing was incessant, and then we went out on the water this morning, and we got a lot of footage on the water with Ukrainian patrol boats with Browning strapped on the back in order to go around and shoot down the Shaheeds. So we got some footage with the Navy. We're doing some work out here. But I wanted to talk today because there's a big story in reference to Odesa and apparently Putin's intentions for it that one European official told the Financial Times. But I wanted to start somewhere else. I wanted to start with a little dribble of a sign that maybe things could be changing when it comes to the Trump administration and sanctions on the Russians. Now, that doesn't mean that Trump is about to come out and champion sanctions in the public eye and tell everybody why what Russia's doing is wrong, why it endangers European security, American security, why it goes against all of the different agreements that the Russians have signed, or Trump's going to become a humanitarian and get on his knees to talk about the human safari. That isn't going to happen. But what I am hearing is that maybe Trump will stop undermining the Senate sanctions bill. Now, for those of you who might not know, Lindsey Graham has a bill on the floor, not on the floor, but he wants to bring it to the floor in the Senate with 84 to, I think now 85 co-sponsors. I think John Ossoff jumped on. I think Tammy Duckworth jumped on. I think it's at 85. It's either 84 or 85. Either way, the vast majority of a 100-member body have signed on to the sanctions package. And what's interesting about the sanctions package is you could call it a MAGA sanctions package, a Trump sanctions package, because what Trump said on the campaign trail was that if he doesn't end it either before he's inaugurated or within 24 hours, he doesn't get the war over quickly, he is going to unleash not only a large amount of new aid to Ukraine that's going to be larger than what Biden did and is going to show American peace through strength, but also there's going to be tough sanctions placed on the Russians. And he said secondary sanctions. Now, hearing that on the campaign trail, I didn't believe it because I knew how devastating secondary sanctions can be. For those of you who don't know, a secondary sanction is not only when you sanction a country, but you sanction the countries that do business with that country. So instead of just sanctioning the Russian energy industry and saying we will not buy your oil, our allies will not buy your oil, those who want to associate with us closely will not buy your oil, you'll say if anybody buys your oil, we're going to place sanctions on your products, and you're going to feel the effect of continuing to facilitate the Russian war economy. And this would be particularly concerning for India, which buys up quite a lot of Russian energy export at a heavy discount because, well, there's not as many buyers as there used to be, and the Chinese. Knowing that and knowing the economic consequences of that if the Indians decided to take it on the chin, or exactly how big of a move that was, it's part of the reason why the Biden administration never did it. I never knew how much faith to place in it, and so I never placed much faith in it to begin with. Then I heard that Donald Trump was interfering in the Senate and telling them to water down the bill, the very same bill that he said he wanted exactly what was in that bill. Now he's elected, things have changed. And he was trying to water down the bill to make it softer on the Russians, as he openly admitted he was holding back sanctions after every single deadline, the 24-hour deadline, the 100-day deadline, the three-week deadlines, the ceasefires that he brought about falling apart. None of this seemed to inspire action. So the Senate was clamoring for some movement. They wanted to show that they could do something after 150 days of inaction and clear evidence that this type of strategy is not working. If it was going to show any success, I think 150 days in, with a ceasefire not negotiated after crossing all these red lines about you got to do a ceasefire this day or that day or there will be consequences. I think it isn't working. And I think that that is what the conclusion that most senators, most Congress people, and most people around the world have come to. So I only could say Trump You got to go through with the bill or you're not going to get any change. If you don't go through with the bill, we're going to be where we're at. Well, according to Lindsey Graham, the person who is leading the bill in the Senate, he says that Donald Trump is ready for the bill to go forward. Now, let me read you some of the text from Lindsey, because there's a little addendum at the end that we need to pay attention to. For the first time yesterday, the president told me, it's time to move your bill. He said this to ABC News. When asked if Graham expected Trump to sign the bill, the senator responded, yes, I think we're in good shape, but he has a waiver. It's up to him on how to impose it. Graham said he held back the talk with Trump during, he held the talk with Trump during a round of golf on June 28th. No specific timeline was provided as to when the bill can be expected to be moved, although Congress is set to reconvene on July 9th. So this is not going to be visited until next month. Well, I guess maybe at the time this is being published this month, but until Congress reconvenes. On one hand, this is Trump giving a positive indicator to one of Ukraine's supporters in the Senate, Lindsey Graham, that, hey, maybe it's time to move forward on the bill. Maybe we can move forward on the bill. One second, Odesa's getting bombed. You heard that, right? Yeah, you heard that. Well, anyway, this was a good sign, but there's a few addendums. Number one, when is it going to be moved through the Senate? Because talking about doing things has happened for 150 days. So until a trigger is pulled, the Russians could read it as another bluff, just like they did with this idea of agree to a 30-day ceasefire or consequences will come. Drew a red line in the sand, the same red line that many conservatives criticized Obama for doing when it comes to Syria and then not delivering on it. Trump did the same thing in an even more, piffy fashion. Just there's no reaction whatsoever than even Obama did when it comes to his actions in Syria. And so if the Russians can bluff you out every time until you pull the trigger, they're not moving on it. And the last thing I heard from Trump in public was that he was holding back on sanctions, he was holding back on X, Y, and Z until he had, more conversations with Putin. And who knows how those are gonna go? Maybe Putin's gonna look at Trump and this time and say, oh, well, I know those 3 2-week deadlines didn't work out, and I know all those other deadlines didn't work out, and I know the ceasefire didn't hold, but I'll give you peace if you answer my 3 riddles, which will truly dazzle your mind and solve this crossword puzzle. I don't know what Putin's gonna say, but his goal is going to be delaying American action if it cannot be prevented or preventing it entirely. If he can't prevent it entirely, then if he can delay it for 200 days, then that's better than 150 days. If he can delay it for 250 days, then that's better than 150 days, which is how long he has delayed it so far. And Trump having the waiver on how this is enforced gives Trump a lot of flexibility on how to apply the pressure and how to remove the pressure, which might be why Trump is willing to sign on to it. I'd be much more comfortable with Congress introducing sanctions and then Congress going out there and removing sanctions once the war is over. That makes more sense to me. Maybe not all the sanctions, but some amount of the sanctions, depending on how the war ends. You get the idea. So until I see this go through and they actually have a floor vote on it, and until I see Trump go out there.
Not an explosion.
That was not an explosion, but I would say people should not slam their doors loudly during air alerts. Definitely when there are explosions going off at the same time. That's very bothersome. Also, please adjust your mufflers, okay? I see like every time one of these little bikes or cars go by, I see so many people like at dinner or at the store just like go immediately turn their heads. You need to adjust your mufflers. So, will there be movement on this? Maybe in mid-July. If there is movement on it, will Trump utilize that movement in order to apply pressure to the Russians? That has yet to be seen. He still wants to continue to talk to the Russians because I still think that his goal was normalization, and that won't happen under the current paradigm of Russia invading the country and doing all of this. So the only avenue, I think, is for Trump to get so frustrated with the Russians just not throwing him any bone I mean, the deal of stop the fighting where it is and you basically de facto control it, that's a great deal for the Russians when you consider how much exactly they're getting away with. The fact that the United States is not demanding any like war crimes tribunal for everybody who burnt down villages or went and filled up mass graves or are hunting civilians in the human safari, that doesn't mean the Ukrainians won't try some Mossad stuff or some other avenues, or work with the Europeans to have a separate tribunal. So if in 20 years some war criminal travels to Spain on vacation, they might not be snatched up and then put before a Ukrainian court. But that's to say that that is not a key demand that the Trump administration has put forward. And in this time period, what demands by the Russians have been conceded? We've seen NATO get conceded. We've seen the idea of American troops being deployed in the country get conceded. We've seen Ukraine's direct participation in the talks be something that's flexible. That was a really ironclad commitment from the last administration that they had to be at the table, because the idea was until Russia starts treating Ukraine like a country that deserves some basic recognition, well, then we're not going to get anywhere and the situation isn't going to change. And let me just say that despite the fact that we might give some movement on this, that doesn't mean that all European leaders are on board with this or that everybody in Trump's orbit is on board with this. There's still some sentiment like this. One second, let me talk about what the Slovak foreign minister had to say. One second. This is what the Slovak foreign minister say. Minister Blanner, during a domestic media interview on June 29th, argued the war in Ukraine could not be resolved militarily and called for return for diplomacy, suggesting Russia could be forgiven. Let us return to respect for international law and seek ways to communicate with the Russian Federation, and perhaps even forgive everything that has happened. I don't know where this Lex Friedman fever has come from. Once you speak in this language, every Ukrainian immediately tunes you out. And I would even say that a very significant portion of those who could find themselves on the bad end of Russian war crimes or have historically, whether we're talking about the Poles or others, have found themselves on the worst side of Russian war crimes. They're not going to take to this kindly. And the Ukrainians didn't. I remember their foreign minister responded just the next day. Here it is. Russia's sense of impunity is the root cause of its crimes. It's naive to expect a criminal to stop if their crime is forgiven instead of punished. Russia will hit your other cheek as well, and those who have lost no one in this war have no right to make such statements. I mean, look, forgiveness is a Ukrainian topic. Forgiveness is a completely domestic topic. It is not a French topic, it's not a German topic, it's not a Slovak topic. If it's crimes done against the Ukrainians, it is a Ukrainian topic. But as Russia is making clear that it still wants to conquer Kherson, and it still makes that base demand, as they still make the demand about Zaporizhia, and as we're getting reports from the Financial Times that possibly, according to some senior European officials, they quoted a senior European official for this Financial Times piece, the Russians' goal, Putin's goal, is still to conquer locations like Odesa, which isn't even part of his key list of demands. But if you look at Russian media, if you look at how the Russians talk about Odesa, if you look at how Putin views Odesa or how Putin views Ukraine as a whole, I mean, yeah, they do believe Odesa is part of Russia. Yeah, there are nationalists who want to conquer it. Yes, there was a threat of the Russians doing a landing in Odesa at the very start of the war. That was, as the war went on and the war did not go in the way the Russians planned, started to go apart. But when you're here in Odesa and you're talking to people, this is a threat that still perpetuates itself. I mean, I hear people say my biggest fear is occupation. My biggest fear is the idea of those soldiers marching into our towns and then we are at their mercy. If you go and you know what's happening in Kherson, if you knew what happened in Izium with the largest mass grave uncovered since the Yugoslav genocides, yeah, that's going to be something that's of grave concern to you. And these are non-concedable issues. So if we have European officials suggesting that the Russians are just going to keep barreling past even their current unattainable and unconcedable demands. So how do you respond to that? You can only respond to that the one way, And that has to be changing the conditions on the ground. So the Russians, whether they want Odessa, whether they want Kherson, whether they want these other locations, whether they think they're in Ukraine forever, they have to find out through the reality of on-the-ground warfare that they can't move forward, that this is a brick wall, that they have to come to the table and negotiate. And this doesn't have a this isn't historically unprecedented. While most people know the Korean War for like the horrible like grinding bloodshed that perpetuated for like nearly 3 years, in 1951, the Yanks were done. We wanted out of the war. We wanted it to be over. Stalin didn't want it to be over. And for another 2 years we fought until Stalin was in a puddle of his own piss. And so then the Chinese said, and the new leadership coming into power, okay, I think maybe we can make a settlement. Now, I'm not saying that we need a Korean-style settlement here. What I am saying is that the idea of one party being willing to do unilateral ceasefires, in the case of Ukraine, or the other party being not willing to do that, the historical reaction has not usually been, okay, let's undercut the party that wants to come to the table. Let's undercut their support base. Maybe that will make the party that doesn't want to come to the table, once they're informed they're going to have an easier go of it, to come to the table. It's not going to work. It is not going to work. And the Ukrainians are preparing for this outcome. Zelensky just withdrew Ukraine, or he is he just signed it. I thought he was about to sign it, but no, he just signed it. Withdrawing the Ukrainians from the Ottawa Treaty, which basically means that they are pursuing anti-personnel landmine warfare in Ukraine, that they're probably going to go on international arms markets and try to purchase them up, and they're probably going to go into domestic manufacturing of these landmines. There would be no other reason to do that. Now, of course, these landmines have humanitarian implications. I lived with deminers in the Kharkiv region as they demined liberated territory. A lot of times how you find out that these mines are a problem is when a dog sets them off and you can hear it in the distance, or if it's worse, civilians set them off or they find them. And you can find these PMF-1 butterfly mines within 50 feet of old babushkas' homes. You can find TM62 anti-tank mines stacked on top of each other, set to booby trap if somebody tries to remove them in people's backyards. You find the Russian equivalent of a claymore tied to trees randomly in the forest, and people go in the forest to scavenge. People go in there to get mushrooms. People go in there to just like hang out. People go out there to camp. People go out there to smoke pot and do whatever. And so that's danger. That's telling Ukrainians and telling people who live in this land that, for decades to come, there's going to be a threat that you walk in your own backyard and you go kaboom. That's the reality of mine warfare. But the Ukrainians have come to the conclusion that whether or not they are of the humanitarian inclination that these mines are, bad for their communities, they're also extremely effective, and the Russians are using them anyway. If you look at a big reason why large-scale mechanized warfare has turned into like terrible trench warfare, even though all warfare, of course, is bad, it's because these minefields are making it so armored vehicles blow up, and then the next one gets hit by an FPV, and this combination of tank traps and barbed wire and tons of mines and $1,000 FPVs strapped with RPG warheads has been enough to dissuade these large-scale mechanized offensives from continuing endlessly, because they would literally run out of armored vehicles, which is crazy to say, but the largest Soviet stockpile in the world. The largest armor stockpile in the world, not just Soviet stockpile, but it's true. They've burnt through a majority of their armor, and the armor's getting older and older and older, and we're starting to hear reports about T-62s, there's always rumors of going further and further and further than that, but the last reports I saw was of old T-62s. I've even seen some instance of tanks that were designed in the Stalin era being used in certain roles. Of course, those aren't the predominant tanks, but it just shows you that they're really going for anywhere for these mechanized vehicles because of how, in part, devastating these mines have been. And those are anti-tank mines. Anti-personnel mines, well, think about that stage of the war. You're relying more and more and more on infantry assaults. If you go into the Sumy region, I don't know of really any unit that's, I know a lot of these units that are fighting over there. I don't know of any unit that has disabled an armored vehicle there. I think I saw one video of an armored vehicle getting destroyed. It's all infantry. The corpses I've seen from it, it's from infantry. And that's because the Russians have realized that there's more of them than there are of the Ukrainians. And so if they keep swarming their position, it's painful, it costs a lot, but they move forward. Anti-personnel mines is something that is a direct answer to that problem. And so if the Ukrainians are facing getting hunted in the human safari, and the Ukrainians are facing waiving certain levels of Western support, where some countries are picking up support, other countries like the United States are taking a step back, they're going to collapse onto whatever is necessary for the state to survive, because that's what every country would do in their position. Whatever is necessary for the state's survival is what they're going to do. And so what we're facing now is a arms race and drone warfare that makes everything within 15 miles of the front a potential death zone for FPVs, and even more when they send out mothership drones. I mean, that's how Bilapila and other areas like that were having their roads get hit when we were driving over there. That was particularly scary to hear about. As more and more mines are dropped across the battlefield, and I've talked to these deminers, they tell me 80 to 90 year time frames to remove the mines that are out there in the ground now. Of course, assuming no gigantic leaps in drone demining innovation, and there are really smart people in this country that are working on that, like Vlad Sokolov and others. So I'm hoping that won't be the case, but when you're considering that deminers before this war were working on removing mines and artillery shells from World War I and World War II, and now they're gonna have to stack that on top of this massive arsenal of mines and unexploded artillery shells and bombs, I mean, it's a real tragedy. But it's a tragedy, I think, that in a lot of ways is of our own creation, not only because of the foreign policy failures that got us here, but also because of the lack of action once we were here, where we go 50 or 60 to 70% of the way there, and then just kind of hope for the best, or hope that somebody else takes our national security priorities into their consideration. And of course they didn't. Because if you can buck pass the responsibility of someone else to somebody else's taxpayers, of course they're going to do it. And that's what a lot of European powers did. That's what the United States is doing right now. And that is still going to be an issue. So look, the point is we're not moving forward on the current state of affairs. The Ukrainians are digging in. The Russians are continuing to advance. Certain European officials are talking about Putin's demands continuing to go further, much closer to what we talked about at the start of the war when we were suggesting of conquest of Odesa. The human safari is ongoing, and 150 days of failed diplomacy is behind us. So, what do? All Trump has to do is allow the sanctions bill to go through. All Trump has to do is not even send aid bills. He could just sell them weapons and sell it as a gigantic victory that he made the Europeans pay for their defense instead of Americans subsidizing their defense. This could be a foreign policy victory. This could be a policy victory in a time where his approval rating is getting kind of a shellacking right now, and he's not really perceived quite well by independents, a voter base that he should care about if he wants to perform well in the midterms. So I would hope that as the days pass, the pressure builds. But as other news headlines grab and fall out of the stories, the assassination of a Speaker of the House in Minnesota got like 12 hours of airtime. The president then decided not to call the governor and like disrespected him in the process. And that was a 12 to 24 hour news cycle. We had a 12-day air war between, by the way, if people are like, oh, do you call it an air war, okay? That's a descriptive way of saying it. You don't need to be cheesy and scare everybody into World War III. It was an air war. They had a 12-day air war, and that's something that could, if it reignites, pull attention away from Ukraine. And in fact, I will tell you, part of the reason we didn't see action on, or at least the reason that was said by people in the Senate, maybe trying to cover their own ass, one of the reasons we didn't see action in the Senate on this legislation so far, on the sanction package, was they said, oh, well, we have this Israel-Palestine and, Israel-Iran and all this stuff to deal with, so we'll deal with it in July. So there is also the potentialities that either one of these crises that come up to the desk of the president, because he's one of the most powerful men on the planet, or one of these self-imposed crises with a journalist being added to a communication room, a classified chat room, or accidentally like butt dialing like an atomic code or something, whatever the next scandal is going to be from from Tulsi or RFK or Secretary of Party Pete Hegseth, at the end of the day, there's a million different ways for Trump to distract himself. And no matter, even if you make him a Slava Ukraini, Heroem Slava all the way, if he gets distracted and takes his eye off the ball, that's going to be a problem when it comes to sanction enforcement. That's going to be a problem when it comes to the stability of U.S. aid, which has always been this continuous supply of support. Has always been a critique going back to the Biden era. And it's going to be inconsistent pressure, where once again, the Russians can fall back upon the idea of eventually Trump will get distracted because he's the epitome of these problems with American foreign policy culture. He'll get distracted. He'll look on something else. He won't play the long game. And we can hope out for something. And look, maybe the Russian army in a year or a year and a half doesn't have the funds to just keep going. Maybe they don't have the manpower without mobilization that is politically unpalatable. Maybe they try mobilization, but then the cost of mobilization on top of this economic pressure, and maybe they don't attain those things. But here's the problem. There's also a question of just stopping the war where we are, or stopping the violence now because you want to pressure them into stopping, where the war drags out for another year, year and a half, 2 years, when maybe it didn't have to. Did the Syrian civil war need to rage on for 13 years? There's a question about at what point does an action need to be taken to speed up the process, especially when we're so involved, and the people who are now in power were the same people worrying that we need to end this right away because World War III, World War III, World War III. Well, now it seems like you can sit on your hands all day and not worry about it. Either way, this is a moment where maybe we'll start to see something as we approach July, as we go into July. We'll start to see movement on this on the sanctions package. Or maybe we'll see Trump repeat his behavior after a weird phone call with Putin. Either way, Trump being the under support, the pillar of Ukraine from the United States when it comes to weapons deals or sanctions or anything to support them, even if we get through this, is going to be a bumpy road. But at least we can see the road. CBD makes you infertile. The woman cannot.
Well.
Open the video with that. Okay, don't record that. Okay.
It's been recording, so.
Let's start with the bill.